Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Writers and Books Meet the BOA Authors series. I'm Kathy Serna, the Communications Associate here. For those of you who are new to us, Writers and Books is a nonprofit literary arts center in Rochester, New York. We offer readings, workshops, a bookstore, and literary programming for people of all ages and backgrounds. You can find more information at our website, wav.org. Please say hello in the chat and let us know you're there. Feel free to submit questions through the chat or Q&A functions as well. Books are available through our bookstore, Ampersand Books, and I'll make sure to put the link in the chat. Writers and Books would like to call attention to the complex and troubled history of the lands on which we live and work. We are hosting this event from the unceded ancestral homelands of the Onondaga, or the people of the Great Hill. In English, they are known as the Seneca people or the Keeper of the Western Door. We're so happy to have Jeannine Gailey with us tonight. First, we'll hear her read, then she'll be in conversation with author and poet Peter Connors, publisher and executive director of BOA Editions. Against a constellation of solar weather events and an evolving pandemic, Flare Corona paints a self-portrait of the ways in which we prevail and persevere through health adversities while facing an uncertain future. Jeannine Gailey served as the second poet laureate of Redmond, Washington. She is the author of 5 other books of poetry: Becoming the Villainess, She Returns to the Floating World, Unexplained Fevers, The Robot Scientist's Daughter, and Field Guide to the End of the World, winner of the Moon City Press Book Prize and the SFPA's Elgin Award. Her work has been featured on the Writer's Almanac, the American Poetry Review, and the Rumpus. Thank you so much, Jeannine, for joining us tonight. And everyone, I hope you enjoy. Welcome.
Thank you so much. I'm going to start up by saying a little bit about this book. So this is the book Flare Corona, and I wrote it starting in 2016 when I was diagnosed with terminal liver cancer. And Trump had just been elected. And I was given 6 months to live, no treatment. So that was a blow, and so I went ahead and got some other opinions, and eventually they said, well, maybe these tumors aren't the kind that kill you really fast, and I said maybe they won't kill you at all. And so I was just getting my bearings from that when I was went to the hospital again and was diagnosed with multiple sclerosis. A year after that is when the coronavirus hit. So it's been a few years of complex health struggles, and I'm lucky to live in a place that was so beautiful that provided a lot of help for that support. You know, it's a beautiful place. I live out here in Washington State. And so I'll just start I'm going to start a little lighter, and then the poem's a little heavier towards the end. And so this is the first one, Self-Portrait as Murder Mystery. A luxury liner on the high seas loses contact during a storm. A train is trapped in perilous mountains by an avalanche of snow. A cabin on an island when the power goes out. The passengers are suddenly isolated and everyone is a suspect. The kindly nanny may be an American spy, the priest who is most certainly an assassin. Everyone else is a magician or a Nazi scientist. Every detail oozes with malice. The waiter who pours the suspect tea into a cup with studied grace, a newspaper headline that announces bombings in an obscure European town. The anarchist dragged out to be shot by the ever-present police. There are so many coincidences and red herrings that every missing ring, every lost suitcase inherits charged importance. What you love about these stories is the shoestring lace that ties everything together, the trail of clues like pebbles you could follow home to make order out of chaos. How we long for our lives to be as easily solved. What a surprise for the reader when the murderer turns out to be the narrator herself. The way she slipped out of the room at the right time with the gun, the way she misled everyone with her kind smile and rhinestone cane. So this next poem is called Irradiate. My father worked as a robot scientist in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, at a nuclear facility there. And the ground was very, very contaminated with cesium-137, which was in the farm, the food, the animals, and me. So this is called Irradiate. As a child, I was radiant. The land grew irradiated corn and roses, tomatoes large and abundant, swallows and catfish carrying the isotopes into the water and woods. The sun rose each day while the shadows of trees concealed government laboratories where my father worked. I grew up listening to the tap click of the Geiger counter. I grew up listening to clicks on the phone line. I was still innocent, irradiated, to blast with radiation, to sterilize food, medical equipment, a person. I was waiting for a message from the sky. I knew what it meant to illuminate the fall of light in a painting or through an old window that irradiated a field of flowers or the face of someone you loved, to bring the full beauty of something to the surface. I was irradiated by the gentle glow of the computer screen, by the microwave, by the sun growing brighter each spring, dimmer each fall. I meant I was full of radiation. I meant I was full of light. I meant I could give birth to nothing but light. My life is an accident. My life is an accident of DNA and radiation, a million missed chances for death to sweep me off my feet. Too many of this, not enough of that, a witch's spell for trouble, red-haired and scarlet fevered, born with wings and a tail, an immune system weak as a kitten and a knack for being in the wrong weeds at the wrong time. Fascinated with systems, folders, and fossils, tracking down each dinosaur and later delivery systems for rare antivirals, government research into nuclear facilities, conspiracy theories about aliens and solar flares. I was never meant, not planned, not absorbed into the mainstream, never meant to survive this long according to charts and scans. She's a miracle, they said. She's a mutant. She's a baby born of a bad seed. Modern living makes a body bitter, our blood and flesh filled with hormone disruptors, flame retardants, and false positives. But I'm a haymaker, a harbinger, a fateful warning of things to come. Failure 2016. This is the only political poem in the book, I think. I failed to die, as they said I might this year. I watched the icons of my teen years drop one by one, magical in their makeup and costumes, Bowie and Prince and Princess Leia, all glitter and smartass. I watched the election with tears in my eyes while others cheered. I spent a lot of time in hospitals, not writing, waiting for the other shoe to drop. I spent too much time hand-wringing. I spent time planting lavender I wasn't sure I would live to see bloom. I bought a blue-eyed kitten. I took pictures of trees in the wind. Failures were many, lost voices, lost crowds, wandering in the wrong directions. We've lost our sense of smell. All the signs are there. We've barely touched our eggs. Our memories aren't what they used to be. Our hair not as bright. Our hands shake when they should be steady. America lost a bit of its shine. Britain yelled at us on the street to go back home, but where did we come from? Wasn't it on your boats? I've forgotten now English, Gaelic, French, Creole, Spanish, Italian, ancient Greek, so many languages scratched into the dust, into rusty iron pages. They're breaking down. Soon we will all speak emoji, happy or sad faces, angry tongues or double horns. We fail to launch as a nation. I fail to organize my closet, my office, a mess of papers I can't leave to anyone. A painting on my wall of a fox, its eyes glowing, fixed on the gray horizon. It haunts me with its wall of poppies. Where did my nerve break down? What particular cell betrayed me? Are your families fracturing, your synapses leaking? Look to the future. Perhaps that glow you see isn't fire, but sunrise. So it's been, unfortunately, very, very hot here in Seattle. We were 90 degrees yesterday and 90 degrees today. So I've got a poem about the summer. I got a couple of summer poems in this book. So this is called The Summer of Bombs. It was a summer of hydrogen bombs, eclipses, earthquakes, hurricanes, wildfires. We were not exaggerating. The world was covered in smoke. Remember the shooter on that boat on the island? It was the summer everything blew up, including us. The embers of my neurology fell into place like video game aliens about to explode. You couldn't understand. You couldn't see. I could do so much less. The wild smelled like bullets all the time. I couldn't keep down fluids. You couldn't keep down your voice. I needed help. You wanted out. It seemed to me that every man was trying to shake the earth to loosen our grip on things, or maybe that was Mother Nature trying to shake us off. I certainly couldn't hold on when the storm came. It was lights out for me. The bombs in the air had already taken hold in my mind. They had already landed in me, exploded, leaving wreckage. There was no recovery, no map to the future. The sun angry, the sea intolerant. The atoms had shifted, irreparable. So this next poem has a little string theory in it. If you know anything about string theory, that there are different timelines is one of the theories. So this poem is called "This is the Darkest Timeline." This is the darkest timeline, one that started with a roll of the dice, an election gone awry, a time of fire and flood. When we started to panic at every pandemic, went into quarantine, playing quarters. We've all become the evil versions of ourselves, just trying to get back to the prime timeline, the one where everything went right, when our memories weren't clouded by calamity. That butterfly that flapped its wings, the animal virus gone rogue. We couldn't buy butter or bullets. We waited with bated breath underground. When we emerge anew, it will be with new eyes. Our currency changed from cash to cashews and cheese sandwiches. You can't remember the taste of food without 10. You can't remember how to kiss. Your sense of time scrambled. You learned to throw a knife and get fish. The darkest timeline has taken us the way of apocalypse, earthquake, supervolcanoes, and tidal waves. We can't take any more disaster. We buried too many bodies and sheltered in place too long to forget. When we started this journey, there was nothing left to lose. Now we're too tired to remember how fresh fruit used to smell, the pale pink of cherry blossoms, the days before the coyotes took over our street. This next poem I wrote in November of 2019, right before the pandemic broke loose. I had read in the news about a scientist in China who was imprisoned for talking on YouTube about his patients who had gotten so sick. And this poem is called Calamity. It made it into Poetry Magazine. I'd been sending to Poetry Magazine since I was 19 years old. I was 46 when this poem was taken. Calamity. Your family is coming over for Thanksgiving. Even worse, it's snowing. Headless robots are playing soccer with your soul. UFOs have been sighted overhead. A meteor is definitely heading straight for you. It might miss, but then again. Tonight, a city is being decimated by Godzilla. Or was it a bunch of genetically engineered dinosaurs? Either way, I hope you're lizard friendly. Tonight, you have to give a speech and that girl who hated you in 3rd grade will be in the audience. What have I ever done to deserve this? The prophet asks, tearing his robes in the desert, and God responds, how long you got? A plague of egrets, of egress. A black hole has just opened up and it is already swallowing someone else's sun. Did you see the team play tonight? A travesty. Someone is always preaching about doomsday. Who are you wearing? Because tonight your life will be required of you. Grab a bag, a sword, a water bottle. Go out swinging. So the next few poems are about coronavirus. When the coronavirus hit, one of the things I did was apply for a residency on a remote island called San Juan Island. And when we got there were all kinds of foxes. But another thing that happened is the boat shut down because there was a strike. The workers didn't want to get the vaccine. So we were kind of stranded on this island and there were no grocery deliveries or mail deliveries. It was really apocalyptic, but interesting. So this is called In a Plague Year, I Found Foxes. In a plague year, I found foxes all around, on islands, red fur, gray, dusky black, shades of autumn leaves, eyes amber and unafraid, standing in grasses, waiting for us. I found the fox inside me, curling up in twigs and fur, my sharpened teeth and hunger. I burrowed in to protect us from the plague, but there was nowhere to run. Like flames in the forest, it was all around us, lives going up in smoke. I never left the forest. I trusted only familiar paths, familiar smells, dirt, trees, beetles, berries that stained our mouths. I drew poems in the dust. I grew a tail. I left fox fur wherever I went. I don't know how I will come back, or if I will. Our burrow now littered with bones and mushrooms, a home for the spirits of the dead. I could never outrun death. It is coming for us both. Enjoy the colors of this winter sunset, the bare branches, the visits of other foxes, their cries in the night, the softness around us, the tenderness of endings. This is called, this is based on a true story. I really did plant a fig tree In the second year of the plague, I plant a fig tree because I want to know what it's like to be new again, Eden with green figs and honey. It will just be you and me and maybe a snake for company. Already the roses are growing a thorn hedge around us. Listen to me, sing a new song, burn rosemary and rose petals. We'll become a city on a hill. We've paved the way with things we lost, cake flour, lipstick, a discarded pile of masks smiling up at us like ghosts. We dreamed of this day, but did not remember how much it cost us. We've already forgotten the way things were before the plague, nightclubs, sharing an appetizer with a friend, casual hugs, even accidentally brushing a stranger's hand. So we'll be born again, love, standing under this tree, new and shiny as apples, free to make a new world, free of memory, ignorant of God or virus, demon or machine, empty of knowledge, ready to start over, ready to start with a plate of green figs under the juice of the ripening moon, ready to grow roots into the earth. So this is, I am 3 poems away from being done, so hang in there. Introduction to writer's block. There's something with MS that's called aphasia, where you kind of lose words. So when you want a hairbrush, you ask for something completely different, like a pomegranate, or you just can't get the right words to come back. And I had problems reading for a little while as well when I had my first flare. Introduction to writer's block. It was right after they had taken a picture of my brain and showed me those dark shadows called lesions. You said, "You've lost your muse," and you took me to the movies, to museums. We walked along the ocean and the mountains, and still I couldn't write. I've lost my words, I told you. Although technically we knew they were still in there, somewhere, teeming and crowded, but sometimes I would confuse one with another aphasia. You can write with just the words you have, I told myself. Writers write, so you just sit down and do it. But what stories are left to tell? My brain has been crammed full of riots and police beatings, bombings in distant lands that were the birthplaces of roses and pomegranates, salmonella in the peanut butter, sunspots causing continental drift. You have to shove all that aside. Maybe listen to some music, that new band, something with dragons. Even at the end of the world, you can make fire. If you wait long enough, something inside will ignite. Quick sip of water here. A conspiracy of ravens began. Do you remember the night before you died? The way the moon was a silver sliver, the wind pushed the dead leaves along the ground, and the ravens sat outside my window, though their dark wings shadowed everything. The smell was of something burning, chemical and acrid. I used to sing songs about flying away. I used to be a believer. Do you remember that? I used to be bright as a flower. The night you died, what did you used to say to me? That you loved my nose, that you'd follow me anywhere. And now I cannot follow. It's so dark I cannot follow the shadows outside my window. The moon is almost nothing. Do you remember the last thing you said? The way the ravens outside were screaming your name. The way the whole earth shook beneath us. The way the night arrived as if it would never end. And this is the last poem. When I thought I was dying. When I thought I was dying, it was easy to love things. Birds, the flutter of branches, my husband who always has to be right. I thought, I will lose all of this. I hugged my cats more. I watched less television, except for comedies, which drug me to sleep at night. Stupid 50s sci-fi films especially, but maybe I loved them too. I loved poetry and wrote almost every day, thinking I do not have time to write. The lights would flicker and threaten outages. How like our bodies these power lines are, reliable until they are not, eaten by rats or rammed by cars at random. You see how I thought everything was profound, my Netflix recommendations, passing a woman on the street and smiling. I ate a lot more pancakes, something I hadn't done since childhood. I thought, maybe there will be a miracle. Maybe I will have more time, a temporary grant of extension. I will still do taxes and fill out forms at the doctor's office. I will still have time to be mad at traffic. I will stop petting random dogs. I will have time to stop noticing when the hummingbird or deer or stellar jay pauses to look in my eyes that moment before. That's the thing about having time. You miss so much. Thank you. Thanks so much.
Thank you for sharing those. It's so great to hear them in your voice. So I'd love to just, to get us started, to talk just about the title even, because to me, it's one of these things, it's this nice, concise title, which I love. It's easy to remember, it's really, it really just hits. But at the same time, it's, as Walt Whitman would say, it contains multitudes. It really opens out. So could you unpack the title a little bit for us and talk about it and how it relates to the subject matter in the book?
Sure. So this book was originally just called Flare. When it began, it was really just about solar weather, which I kind of got obsessed with for a while. There were a lot of eclipses, solar eclipses that happened in 2016, and there were a lot of lunar eclipses. I was noticing that the way the weather was being affected by the sun and sunspots and all this stuff. And then, of course, when your MS is active, it's called a flare. And my first flare, I lost my ability to walk and talk and read all at the same time. So that was someone. Also, I was vomiting all the time. I don't recommend it. But so that's called a flare. And I was thinking about solar weather and the flare. And then when coronavirus came along, I started writing poem after poem. I studied biology. My first degree is in biology. So I was studying the virus, the different things about it. And one of the things that really was interesting to me is the corona part of the virus, which is this sort of halo crown that this virus wears that protects it and helps it be more effective. So I was also thinking about eclipses and how eclipses have the flare and the corona. That's what the visual art for the book came from, that idea of the flare and the corona of an eclipse. So yeah, it had a little bit to do with solar weather, a little bit to do with autoimmune things, and then it had to do with the virus. So it all just kind of came together at the end, I think.
And the cover is so striking. I hope people get a chance to see it in person, because we could hold it up and you could sort of get the idea, but it's a beautiful, beautiful cover.
It is.
Designed by Sandy Knight, always crack designer.
Yes.
So, and obviously, the book talks about multiple health crises happening at the same time, overlapping, impacting each other. And it's so central to the book. And it made me wonder, do you write through, and I know this is an ongoing thing, so I don't want to be like, when that happened, what was it like? Like, this is an ongoing thing. When there are, let's say, flares, in the heat of this, as happens in this book, are you writing during those periods, or is it the sort of thing like, I just got to get through this, and then the writing comes later, maybe taking notes, or how is the process with that?
For the first diagnosis, the terminal cancer diagnosis, I wrote a lot. I just thought I got to get everything out now because I might not have time. So I was writing all the time with that. And then unfortunately, when the MS hit, it was a bit of I was a bit more clunky because I couldn't read. Not reading was really a struggle. And then not being able to speak, not being able to remember words. Glenn said, my husband is named Glenn. He said it made your poetry more experimental. And I think that might be true, that I would make different connections than I used to make because I wouldn't have the right word. I'd have a different word, or, the things would sort of move around in my head. So that definitely affected my writing. And I did not write as much, especially when I was in pretty intensive therapy to get to walk again and swallow and talk and all those things. And then when coronavirus hit, I wrote all the time. I think I wrote 200 coronavirus. I mean, I could put together 3 books of coronavirus poems today. They're not all winners, of course, but I wrote a lot because, we were all shut up in our houses, and all I could do was walk around my yard and my garden. And I do have a kick-ass garden now, which is another nice thing about being closed up. You kind of get productive in the ways you can be productive. Yeah, so I wrote a lot during that time. There were a lot of poems that I didn't put in this book. I really wondered about even putting any coronavirus in there, but I think that it sort of brings stuff together because the coronavirus is really a universal experience, whereas people will have cancer scares and people might get autoimmune problems like MS, but coronavirus is something that was communal, that we all went through. So, so it was a question about whether to include those poems or not, but in the end, I decided to include them.
Yeah, well, it becomes in its own way. I mean, the combination of your own health issues with obviously what everybody was experiencing as this sort of public crisis is really fascinating. In a lot of ways, I think it makes, our experiences of Corona, it puts them into a different perspective, as a whole.
Yeah.
So, and then, I was thinking about our chat today, like this is the question I like to ask people sometimes is like, what do you hope people can glean from this book, if they read it and walk away from it? But it started to occur to me, it would be really interesting to give this book to a class of like medical professionals who are graduating,
Sure.
doctors, nurses, what have you. And let's say we did that, it's graduation day and they get their diploma and they're given a copy of this book. What would you hope that they would take away from it specifically?
That would be wonderful. I think that there's a connection between medicine and poetry that doesn't get connected often enough. And I do occasionally give my doctors copies of my books, and I always wonder what they think or if they do anything. But with this book, I really, a couple of the things would be just knowing how words like terminal or 6 months to live can be very destructive and may not be accurate. So the power of words, it really needs to be implanted earlier in medical school. The other thing was what a dehumanizing experience it is to be part of the medical machine. I know doctors can't help the insurance systems, and the insurance systems really don't care about you. And you can really feel like a cog in a wheel in a very negative way. Just going in for blood work and MRIs and the techs, you're just in and out of hospitals. It makes you see yourself as a non-functioning object. I wrote a book of poetry called Robot Scientist's Daughter, where I imagined becoming a cyborg because the cyborg would function correctly, and that. So I would hope that it would give medical professionals some insight into what it is to be diagnosed with terminal cancer or with MS, or to go through coronavirus, the psychological and psychiatric kind of impact of those things. Because when you sit down and have your 15 minutes with your specialist, they're not always super sensitive to that stuff. So I've had a string of really great doctors, but I've also had a string of really bad doctors. So it's, I hope medical professionals do read this book. It would be really nice. And I meant to be a doctor. That was my original plan. My body ended up being against that. But my first degree was in pre-med biology. That's what I wanted to do.
Oh, wow. Okay. Yeah, I would love to see that happen too. So we'll have to talk more about that, because the more I thought about it, the more I thought this would really be fantastic for medical professionals to have. And you said something really early on too. You said there's a strong connection between medicine and poetry. Could you just expand on that a little bit?
For me, what's really interesting is if you go on, there's like ResearchGate or these academic libraries, you can find that I'm included in a couple of medical papers because my poems have been cited by doctors as examples of this rare kind of phenomenon, like hypergraphia is one of them. And I think I'm in a couple of others. My bleeding disorder is fairly rare. So it's interesting that I have been able to interact with poetry, with researchers, because they're looking for a way to describe in their papers what this phenomenon is actually like. And they look for visual art, and they look for literature too that describes it. So yeah, it's sort of interesting, right? That connection. But I think I'm also friends with a lot of doctor poets. One of them is C. Dale Young. He gave me a lot of wonderful advice when I was going through my, god awful couple of years there. And I was thinking, if every doctor was like Dr. C. Dale Young, we would not have any problem. But I also have wonderful friends from school who became doctors who were giving me advice and giving me support the whole time. I am very lucky, because a lot of people do not have that. So anyway, yeah. And I have a doctor friend. She's my best friend from elementary school. She's an ER doctor in Alaska, and she turned a porn shop into a bookstore up in Anchorage, Alaska. So that's the kind of thing I love to see, that, that connection between the arts and science in that way. It's not STEM. That's what I say.
Yeah, well, I mean, yeah, that's really cool. It's an interesting sort of its own study. So along with, a lot of the uniquely human struggles in the book, there's also a lot of allusions and occurrences of nature appearing. And it's easy to see, in reading the book, that you have a strong connection to nature. So can you talk some about the role of nature in your poetry and in this book specifically?
Absolutely. Well, I live in a beautiful place. I mean, Woodinville, Washington is a beautiful area. I was telling you about the lavender farm, and there's farms all around us, and huge. I grew up in Oak Ridge, Tennessee, which, despite being contaminated with radiation, is absolutely beautiful woodland, forest glade, Bambi style. It's a really beautiful place. So I've grown up in some really beautiful places, and I've always connected to nature. I've been an environmentalist. I always joke one of my first poems was protesting nuclear contamination. And it was like a boy in a green raincoat splashes in I don't know what I was trying to do in that poem. I was seven, but so I've always tried to be environmentalist. So the new thing of calling it eco-poetics, that's something I've been doing a long time, because, people and their environments are connected. We do not function independently of them, radioactive fish, radioactive corn, messing up the biology of certain farm things. I don't really agree with that. So, we have to think about the things that we're letting into ourselves when we let them into our environment. And and also the other thing is, when I was, I think you might touch on this later, but the idea of trying to capture the beauty of the natural world when you're suffering is really calming. It's really therapeutic. A painting is helpful. I'm a terrible watercolor, but I'm a pretty good photographer. So I've been taking a lot of photos for the last 3 years of birds and flowers and trees. And we have a lot of really lovely examples of those things here. I've become sort of an amateur naturalist of the Pacific Northwest, because I didn't know much about it when I moved here 20 years ago, but I'm learning.
Yeah, and I know, in addition to your photography, and gardening and nature, you also have appeared in the Best Horror of the Year anthology, which I think you're the only BOA poet that I know of anyway who's appeared in that. Can you tell us some about your well, I'm curious specifically about the horror, but then also how the other art forms that you work in inform your poetry?
Yeah, that is a great and interesting question. When I was younger, like maybe around the time of my first chat book, even before my first book, around 2005, these two editors, Terry Windling and Ellen Datlow, who ran at the time a series called The Best Fantasy and Horror of the Year, had put 4 of my poems in their honorable mentions. And I was like, what is this? I don't know what this is. I don't write fantasy. I don't write horror. I just write my own stuff. It's not what you think it is. But as I came to realize, this community was really open and generous and supportive. And now I belong to both the Horror Writers Association and the Science Fiction and Speculative Poetry Association. So the people in those groups have been warm, and it's like warm and friendly in a way not everybody in the poetry world is. And I felt like it's really been a gift. And a lot of the horror that I write is body horror, which shouldn't surprise anybody who's known my history as a medical experiment. So a lot of the stuff has to do. One of the poems, the latest poem in particular that got into the Best Horror of the Year, was one called Introduction to the Body and Fairy Tales. And just the number of grotesque and horrifying things that happen to the body in these fairy tales, right? Happen to the princesses, the princes, and the bad guys. I mean, everybody doesn't get a fair shake. So that's kind of what inspired a lot of those poems. And then the photography and gardening and those things, I feel like those things have become part of my writing practice too. If I get outside more, if I practice photography more, I tend to be more inspired. And I would say the same thing about, I don't know, I mentioned 1950s science fiction movies. Those are fantastic, and they are a great way to go to sleep. You can't sleep, but they also have really worked their way into my work in a lot of ways. So string theory and Godzilla and all those things, I mean, they sort of creep in.
Yeah, and this book is more, if I'm not mistaken, it's sort of more realist than your other works too, right? They've had more speculative and fabulous and fairy tale elements to them. Is that correct?
Yeah, this one is way more autobiographical and vulnerable. I still have supervillains and apocalypses and obviously Godzilla, some other stuff. So, the solar flares, the talk about, there's a lot of science talk in it too. So in some ways it could still ride that line of speculative writing, but it's for me way more personal. And I felt like I had to do that step, even though my previous 5 books had all been pretty much persona and mythological in basis. But I couldn't tell this story any way but the way I told it. There was no way to communicate this stuff except for just being, kind of straight up, which is I didn't ever want to be boring about it. It's like, well, maybe I could put into this, I could put into this story, but in this book, I just was like, you have to kind of head straight for it rather than try to go around it or try to frame it in something else.
And in some of the poems, it's almost like they walk the line between speculative and realist. And I'm thinking specifically of the self-portrait poems. So there's a bunch of poems in here that are, I'll just read some so people know what I'm talking about. The titles are like Self-Portrait as Murder Mystery, Self-Portrait as Radioactive Girl, Self-Portrait as Weather Report, Self-Portrait as Seismologist, Self-Portrait as Escape Artist, Self-Portrait as Desert During a Super Bloom. And there's others too, Self-Portrait as Wisteria on a May Night. So that's, to me, a really interesting sort of middle ground almost. Why the self-portrait, strategy?
I think the self-portraits were easier for me to write and a way to kind of enter into this subject matter. So those are the first poems that were written for this book. In fact, it was first called, I think, Self-Portrait as Radioactive Girl was one of the very first titles. So I was playing a lot with the idea of, what other places could I identify these stories in, right? Like a seismologist is feeling for unsteadiness and fissures. And that reminded me a lot of looking at the brain, right? Our brains and our bodies have to be tracked. And then when there's unsteadiness, there's warning signs before things happen, right? So the seismologist one made a lot of sense. Murder mystery, I love murder mysteries anyway. And I thought, yeah, we do want to make sense out of disorder, right? That's why we read murder mysteries. And the self-portrait migration actually was inspired by a local event, which was like thousands of snow geese dying because of a contaminated lake in Montana from mining. And the mining was done a long time ago, but the lake is never going to be clean, and it kills migrating birds all the time. And I was like, that's how it is sometimes. We're like these migrating birds. We don't know what we're going to land in. If we land in a lake that's full of poison, so that was some of the inspirations.
It made me wonder, like, is there some liberation in being able to, embody that to just completely shift consciousness into some other, in this case, often, non-human point of view. Yeah.
Forget it. I just want to be a robot all the time. So I can just write those poems all day. But those were really fun poems to write too. Easier. You know what I mean?
Yeah, they're cool. It's sprinkled throughout the collection too. I think it breaks up. It creates this really interesting rhythm for the collection too, the way it's structured. Yeah. So you mentioned C. Dale Young, another poet. Are there any other books or poets that you'd like to sort of shout out and draw attention to?
Yeah, and these are just some recent ones that I really love. But Belly to the Brutal from Wesleyan by Jen Javon, and Dialogues with Rising Tides by my good friend Kelly Agadon. That's at Copper Canyon. I just got a new book called The Badass Brontes by Jane Satterfield. That's a terrific book. And I've been reading some fiction and nonfiction that's kind of interesting. Kelly Link wrote a series of fairy tale based short stories with like kind of a horror bent called White Cat, Black Dog. And then I read a series of nonfiction. I had been following a Sabrina Ora Marks essays in Paris Review. And then she published a collection of them called Happily. And it's kind of telling the story of her life, but with a fairy tale bent. So it's sort of a nonfiction memoir, but with fairy tales. So I'm interested in the way fairy tales can be used in other genres, not just poetry. So those are all, there's probably way more books I should be talking about, but those are like the five I can think of right this second.
Yeah, no, good. Pointing people in the right direction. That's cool. And I just wanted to comment too on your you mentioned the poetry magazine submissions. And I just think that's such a cool story. And I think it's something that a lot of, poets and aspiring poets are it's good to keep in mind. You said you first submitted, I apologize if I get this wrong, I think you said you first submitted to Poetry Magazine when you were 19, and
19 years
your
old.
first poem was accepted when you were 46.
That's correct. A lot of nice projections in between.
Yeah, well, I think that speaks volumes, though, to your commitment. And maybe real quickly before we sign off, could you just talk about the path to publication for Flare Corona? Because it made me wonder, that was an intense process to get into Poetry Magazine. What was the process like with Flare Corona?
This book was so different than my other books that I kind of had to take a new tack, because I researched publishers pretty deeply before I said, I don't just send randomly. And the kind of publishers I've been sending to before were very friendly to, out there science fiction work or fantasy or fairy tales or this kind of thing. So I was kind of targeting the kind of places that would publish something a little bit for, I've never really been a status quo poet, so I couldn't really publish with status quo publishers, you know what I mean? So with this book, I had to kind of reset my mind. And what drew me to sending to BOA was the work by Lucille Clifton and Duran Lux, who are both of them big heroes of mine. I got to work with Duran a little bit at Pacific University, and she had really positive experiences with you guys. And that's how the book ended up in your hands, is that I said, I feel like this book might have a chance at this press at this time. You know what I mean? It's always and I had a couple of other presses that gave it a finalist or almost took it, or were still considering it as a finalist when you took it. So it was getting some good responses, but it was like I kind of had to get it into the right order with the right shift and the right mix to really get it to be the finished portion that is today.
Well, I'm so glad that you sent it to BOA, that we published it. I think it's a fantastic book. I'm really proud that BOA published it, and proud to have you as a BOA poet. So thank you so much for being here tonight with us. And if you wouldn't mind sharing one more poem before you leave, we would appreciate it. And I'm going to sign off for the night. So thank you so much.
Thank you. All right, I'm going to find this last poem, hopefully. Not too much page shuffling. Page shuffling is okay, here it is. This is called Wish You Were Here, Postcard from a Pandemic. We talked yesterday about how it might be the last time we saw one another. What did we say then? How I said I wasn't scared, but I was. It's different here on this side of the water. More deaths. The statistics seem louder. I hope you're trying to garden. I sent you a letter and some Tylenol. You still have my sweater and my circular saw. The last time we ate dinner together, we should have said any kind of prayer. We should have said goodbye. Here's a picture of you in 12th grade. I will remember you when all else has perished. I'll remember you when humanity has been erased from the earth. We have become fairy tales like dragons, faintly remembered. You will be flying and carrying a sword. I will be wearing a red cloak, surrounded by fire. Thank you to everybody for being there. And thank you to Writers and Books. Thank you to Peter and to BOA Editions.
Thank you so much, Jeannine. And thank you so much to all of you for joining us tonight. Jeannine, what wonderful poems. We're so glad and lucky to feel to have you read them to us tonight. For anyone interested in the book, it's available on ampersandbooks.org, which I have linked in the chat. Thank you again to Jeannine and Peter, and have a great night, everyone.
Thank you so much, guys.